Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. My name is Jay Hughley. I'm the interim director here at the Center on Race and Social Problems, and on behalf of our center, the School of Social Work, where we're housed, and the Provost Office here at the University of Pittsburgh, and the full university, and our partners at the Center for Urban Education that are co-hosting us with us today. We'd like to welcome you to this very important and really exciting conversation and talk we're going to have on suburban spaces and racial justice in suburban schools. We definitely want to acknowledge the point and moment in history that we're at right now, where, yesterday we had the verdict in the Chauvin case, which, in some ways, I mean, that was the way many of us, or most of us, all of us wanted it to go. It was not the end all be all of racial justice and policing, and there's much more work to be done in that regard. So I think, there's, some cautious gladness that turned out that way, but also acknowledging this is a much longer journey than only what we saw there. And that was exhibited by the tragic killing of Ma'Khia Bryant that also occurred on the very same day. And so we just want to acknowledge that we're coming to this moment and this time with very mixed feelings about where we are and making that in progress in those areas, and that there's an emotional toll for these events for us that really are invested and care about them and are affected by them personally and professionally. So we appreciate you taking time today to join us for this conversation, given all that's going on in the world, but at the same time, it empowers us to do this important work in today around spaces of education. And so with that said, today, very important topic, thinking about suburban education. When we think about students of color, when we think about Black and Latinx students in particular, we often will box them into conversations around what's happening in city schools or what we call urban spaces. But the suburbs are changing and have been changing. And many of the dynamics that we tend to think about when we think of racial justice in schools are now spreading out to other locales and have lots of implications. And we brought in today one of the national experts in this area to really enlighten us and help us to think about the framing of those issues. Now, my job in this, and I'm very fortunate today to introduce my co-host and our co-hosting organization, the Center for Urban Education, and Lori DeLelli O'Connor, who is one of my close collaborators and a fantastic colleague and a brilliant scholar. So Dr. DeLelli O'Connor is an assistant professor of education at the University of Pittsburgh, Center for Urban Education. Her research focuses on examining connections between families, communities, and education across spaces, with a particular focus on fostering equity and justice for children and youth of color in urbanized educational systems. Dr. DeLelli O'Connor earned her PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. She also holds an MED in secondary education from Boston College, where she was a Donovan Urban Scholar and taught secondary social studies in the Boston Public Schools. Her research has been published in the American Educational Research Journal, Teachers College Record, and Urban Education, among other outlets. She is also co-author of the 2019 book, These Kids Are Out of Control, Why We Must Reimagine Classroom Management for Equity. So very happy to have you today, Lori. How are you?
I'm good, Jay, and thank you for that introduction and the opportunity. So I'd like to thank you for also recognizing the emotions that we're all bringing in today, as well as for this opportunity to speak with Dr. Diamond and for us to push forward the work we know we need to do in forwarding racial justice in what we continue to be reminded is an unjust society. especially for Black and Brown children and their families. And I would also like to take a moment to remind everyone, we can't see you, but we're so grateful for you to be in community with us today. And we want to remind you to breathe, to take that time to breathe, to take care of yourself and to take care of each other as we move forward today. So welcome to what I've been excited about all semester and what I know will be an engaging and necessary talk and discussion today. So along with my colleagues at the Center for Urban Education, I am excited to co-host and to have the honor of being the introducer for today's speaker, Dr. John B. Diamond. Dr. Diamond is the Kellner Family Distinguished Chair in Urban Education and Professor of Education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, and a faculty affiliate in Afro-American Studies and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Diamond is a sociologist of education, go sociology, and he studies the relationship between social inequality and educational opportunity. But more specifically, he examines how educational leadership, policies, and practices shape students' educational opportunities and outcomes. Dr. Diamond is also the director of the Race, Education, and Organizational Change Lab, a research group working on race and education issues in demographically changing institutions and communities, with the goal of studying how race impacts educational opportunities and also identifying ways to make schools more racially just. He has written numerous articles and reports, as well as published 2 books, a co-edited volume with James Spallon, Distributed Leadership in Practice, which came out in 2007 through Teachers College Press, and Despite the Best Intentions, How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools, co-authored with Amanda Lewis from Oxford University Press in 2015, and which is coming out in a 2nd edition, I was excited to see. He is currently writing a new book that details the centrality of whiteness and white supremacy in undermining Black education, and that's under contract with Harvard Education Press. And in January 2022, Dr. Diamond will become the co-editor of Sociology of Education with Otis Johnson. In addition to his current positions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Diamond has held other faculty positions at Northwestern University, Harvard University, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So I was excited to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Diamond because I've come to know his work from the very beginning of my graduate career and have engaged it ever since. We graduated from the same PhD program in sociology at Northwestern about 15 years apart. And Dr. Diamond was and continues to be a scholar that I seek to emulate because he engages the importance of race, place, and space in educational inequalities, but not with only a focus on academic understanding, but also on identifying and supporting schools, districts, and families in ways to make schools more racially just. In particular, his work on families of color has shaped and inspired my own research understandings and my own commitments as a scholar and as a human being. And I want to just, as I wrap this introduction, because I know you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from Dr. Diamond, but I want to just share some words from a 2020 blog post that he wrote that I think really encapsulates why I seek to not only sort of forward the kind of work that he's doing, but also, seek it out to read and to share with my students and to really consider it and center it in the work that I do. And he wrote, "To be sure, all parents try to do what is best for their children, but when doing what is best builds on unearned legacies of race and class oppression and further exacerbates longstanding patterns of stratification, we need to re-examine who we claim to be and what we value. Generations of opportunity hoarding have contributed to staggering race and class disparities in educational opportunities and outcomes, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor on a host of indicators of life chances. At this moment," and this was written in 2020 as we were moving into COVID, right? "When our failures to effectively respond to COVID-19 and its unprecedented economic reverberations have combined with a long delayed reckoning with systemic white supremacy brought on by the Black Lives Matter movement, we need to embark on a new path rooted in racial and economic justice, not opportunity hoarding and exploitation." So we thank you for being with us today, Dr. Diamond, and I know I speak for everyone here when I say we're really excited to hear everything that you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank Professor Hughley for inviting me, along with the Center for Urban Education, and the introduction, Dr. DeLille O'Connor. Um, it was perhaps the best introduction I've ever had. So thank you so much for your generous and kind words. I'm really excited to be here today. And as Dr. Hughley mentioned at the beginning, you know, we're sort of ushering our way through this conversation on the heels of the decision yesterday. And I think it's important to recognize that the Black Lives Matter movement gained energy and power in some dimensions in a suburban context, right? Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis, in many ways became a galvanizing point for the movement, and sort of in some ways it sort of led to what we saw yesterday in the conviction of Chauvin. And so I really think it's important, though, to remember that our image of suburbs and suburban communities needs to in some ways be disrupted, right? Ferguson is a suburb, but it's not our typical vanilla suburb that people think of when you think about, well, many of you may not think about this, but I think about Parliament Funkadelic and Chocolate Cities when I think of the idea of how we construct suburbs. Compton is a suburb, right? There are many places that we think of and associate with central cities that are suburban contexts. So for today, I want to begin by disrupting these ideas about what we think of as suburbs, rethinking race, white supremacy, and suburbs and suburban schools in the context of my work and the work of folks that I've worked with recently. We recently published a piece in Educational Researcher that sort of detailed the ways in which suburban contexts need to be reexamined. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about whiteness and opportunity hoarding, particularly as it plays out in suburban schools. And here I'll draw on my recent piece that's coming out on opportunity hoarding, but it's also my book, Despite the Best Intentions, that I wrote with Amanda Lewis. And then I want to spend a few minutes talking about future directions for research on suburban schools. But before I get into that, I want to sort of, in line with disrupting our ideas about suburban schools, I also want to inject a way of thinking about race that I think is really important for us, and as we're thinking about it as a systemic phenomenon, right? Race is not just a way to categorize people, it's a way to categorize people in the interest of power. So race emerged to justify slavery, colonialism, settler colonialism, and genocide by defining people identified as white as superior to people racialized into other categories, right? It became a way to justify that level of exploitation, that level of human degradation, and to make it seem okay, right? But race is also deeply intertwined with ideas about intelligence, moral worth, righteousness, and criminality, as we've seen in the criminalization of Black young people and Black bodies historically, and as Khalil Muhammad has talked about in his book, The Condemnation of Race, of Blackness, in laying out the ways that racial statistics around crime, for example, come to define what Blackness means. In the context of schools, these ideas about intelligence or lack of intelligence become really powerful mechanisms through which people come to see Black students, Latinx students, in comparison to white students in the context of schools. But race is not just a set of ideas, it's also codified into laws and social structures that create what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls a racialized social system, right? And that system plays itself out in the ways that the Constitution was written, in the ways that people understand who has rights before the law, and it becomes embedded in our organization. So schools are essentially what Victor Ray has called racialized organizations. They are organizations that are fundamentally shaped by race and the racial dynamics that exist outside of them and embed themselves inside of them. I also want to expand the definition of white supremacy. Many of us think of white supremacy as exemplified in the January 6th invasion of the White House by people carrying white supremacist symbols in an effort to steal the election. But white supremacy is much more than just being about hate groups. It's a continuum that shapes many of our social institutions. As legal scholar Francis Ainsley says, by white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to self-conscious racism or white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to the political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas about white supremacy are embedded, and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. And we can think about this in the context of our contemporary schools. The fact that over 80% of teachers and over 80% of administrators are white suggests that the field itself is defined by the overrepresentation of white educators serving students who are, as of recently, more students who are minoritized than white, right? And education has played a central role in propping up white supremacy historically. If we look back at the history, these are just a few examples. We can think about the anti-literacy laws that emerged to keep people who were enslaved from learning how to read, in part in response to resistance, like Nat Turner's rebellion and David Walker's appeal, and also as a result of the belief that learning how to read could lead people to desire freedom even further and sort of organize to get it, right? It functions in the establishment of Native American boarding schools that were designed to sort of inculcate indigenous folks with white supremacist notions and actually eliminated their speaking of their own languages. What my graduate school colleague James Fenelon calls culturicide, right? It functions through the attack on the schools that Black people established after the Civil War. Jarvis Givens talks about the fact that there were 600 Black schools burned down between 1866 and 1876 in his really powerful recent book called Fugitive Pedagogy. It's instantiated in the ways that the legal system kept people separate with de jure segregation. It's also exemplified in the way that ethnic studies, we today think about ethnic studies as something that's just a part of our institutions. In the 1960s in San Francisco, when they were trying to establish ethnic studies programs, there was violent resistance to that happening. It's also the ways in which we keep divided our schools, right? The urban-suburban divide, for example, that was maintained through Milliken v. Bradley is another example of how keeping young people separated in schools and then distributing resources unequally across those boundaries between Black, Latinx, and white is another way that this plays itself out. And then we can also see it most recently in the executive order and the legislative attacks on critical race theory that we've seen across the country that is having a squelching impact and trying to silence the voices of dissent. So we're thinking about the purposes of schools. We often think about all we need is for people to graduate. All we need is for people to go to college. The reality is we need to rethink schools and understand them as race-making institutions. They are institutions that reproduce racial domination and subordination. As Carter G. Woodson said in 1933 in his powerful book, The Miseducation of the Negro, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him to go here or stand yonder. He will find his proper place and stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one out for his own special benefit. His education makes it necessary. For Woodson and for many Black educators, education was about liberation and that sort of dialectical relationship between pushing for liberation and sort of the white supremacists push back to maintain power is the dynamic in a lot of ways that is in part at the core of many of our education struggles. So I want to turn now a bit to the creation of the suburbs. Many of us know this history, and many of us are somewhat aware of this history, but the creation of the suburbs was a process that involved individual actions, individual choices, and institutional force. The Federal Housing Authority helped increase home ownership by providing low interest rate and by providing loans for people to move to suburban communities. The home ownership rate increased substantially between 1934 and 1969. And it increased largely in suburban context. During this period, suburban context grew rapidly. And at the same time, and this is important to remember, that we often disconnect the fortunes of cities and suburbs when in reality, they're tightly connected, right? At the same time you had this expansion of suburban context, you had government agencies and the banking industry and the home loan corporation redlining communities, identifying communities based on income, based on race, based on immigrant status, in ways that meant that they were considered hazardous. And you can see on this visual from Pittsburgh, the areas that are in red were often considered places that were not desirable to make loans, which in a sense underdeveloped the communities. At the same time, you have suburban communities being created, roads being built, infrastructure being established, all of this being subsidized by the government at the same time, right? If you think about redlining, the racial provisions in the sort of rating of communities were pretty prominent. These are three examples from the underwriting manual in 1936. Usually the protection against adverse influences afforded by these means include prevention of the infiltration of businesses and industrial uses, low-class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups, right? And by inharmonious racial groups, the way that this gets defined is everybody who is not considered white, right? Secondly, the validator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, right? And this also is played out in the context of schools, right? Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. Again, this euphemistic way of talking about people who aren't white, right? So if we think about the suburbs, I argue, and my co-authors, Lynn Posey-Maddox and Maria Velasquez, argue that the growth of suburbs was a white racial project facilitated by multiple levels of government. The real estate industry, banks, the courts, as well as individual families, neighborhood associations, and communities that worked in concert to create racially exclusionary spaces outside city boundaries. These separate urban and suburban school districts were firmly established, and court decisions such as Milliken v. Bradley and the ongoing fragmentation of districts undermining desegregation helped to maintain these as white spaces, or try to help maintain them as white spaces, right? The other piece of this is that the creation of suburbs in some cases actually disrupted communities of color that were outside of central cities in rural areas that were previously existent. In a sense, in the same way that settler colonialism disappears people from the landscape, there were people who were displaced by suburbanization in the first hand and are some ways being displaced back to suburban communities by the gentrification that's happening in central cities. So if we think about the growth of the suburbs, I think it's really important to think about the sort of growth of metropolitan areas. What this shows is between 1910 and 2000, the sort of growth in the metropolitan population, and the fact that most people in the US live in suburban context, that the percentage of folks living in metropolitan areas has increasingly become suburban. So by 2000, most US residents lived in suburban communities, right? Which translates into the fact that most folks who go to school in public schools, almost 40%, go to suburban schools, right? Many of us don't know this because we tend to focus on the big city districts. There tends to be a focus on Los Angeles and New York and Houston and some of these growing places like Las Vegas, where you have, sort of large districts. But the reality is most people who go to school go to suburban schools, all right? But when we look at the education literature, what we find is that the vast majority of the work that identifies a context in the top 5 AERA journals actually between 2000 and 2018 actually focuses on urban schools at a rate of about 80%, right? So our focus has often been on urban schools where the demographic shifts and changes and most of the population actually goes to school in the suburbs, right? The other thing to think about here is that suburban school contexts actually have variation, right? As I said before, Ferguson, Compton, Winnetka, Illinois, are all suburbs, right? They have these different characteristics. And my colleague Erica Frankenberg has done a great job of sort of laying out the different ways that suburban communities sort of look in terms of their racial demographics and the demographic change that's happening. She talked about the existence of what she calls exclusive enclaves that tend to be mostly white and low poverty. There are countywide districts, largely in the southern United States, places that have urban and suburban kind of communities connected in a county district. There are exurbs where people are moving further away from central cities. There are inner ring and transitional suburbs that tend to be more racially diverse, satellite cities, and then there are developing immigrant meccas, or what some have called ethnoburbs, that people live in. So it's really important to have a way of thinking about the various kinds of suburban contexts as we're thinking about suburbs. The other piece of this is that as demographic shifts have happened, the population in suburban schools has transformed. Even since 2006, 2007, when 60% of students in suburbs were white, till the present day, 2017, 2018, where only 48% of students are white. And you can see the increasing population of Latinx students in suburban contexts, as well as Asian students growing in population in suburban contexts as well. And again, distributed in different ways across these different locations. Some of this has to do with immigration processes where people are going directly to suburban contexts rather than central cities and then to suburban contexts, or they're bypassing central cities. So it's important to think about these demographic shifts as we're thinking about suburban school contexts. The other piece of this demographic change, though, is that these institutions and organizations actually tend to still maintain themselves as white institutional spaces. Wendy Leo Moore has talked about the creation of white spaces, looking at law schools historically, but I think it's applicable to thinking about suburban school context. She talks about the fact that racist exclusion of people of color from spaces and positions of power within institutions historically becomes really important. But then there becomes a development of a white normative frame of reference and organizational logic within those places that becomes embedded. And then what winds up happening is through that historic process, even with demographic change in the contemporary context, you still see whiteness as being sort of the foundational orientation of the organizations. And we can talk more about this in the discussion. And the final piece of this is that there's an assertion of law as racist or neutral. We can replace law here with education as racist and neutral and impartial, when in reality, racial stereotypes, status beliefs, and other kinds of ideas about white supremacy get embedded within the organizational context. So what winds up happening in contemporary context is that signifiers of white institutional power and privilege sort of maintain power within the spaces, even as the demographics begin to shift. That racial demographics and the distribution of institutional power still exist along racial lines. In the contemporary era, many people think that not talking about race makes you not racist, and therefore on the good side of the good-bad paradigm that some people think about when they think about racial matters. And so what winds up happening is you have this idea that when you're not talking explicitly about race, that race is not being invoked, when in reality it actually is, and it is used as a form of colorblind discourse that allows white supremacist sort of ideologies to maintain themselves in the context of schools. So I want to shift a little bit to my book with Amanda Lewis and some additional work that I've been doing over the last several years, including the book Defending the Color Line that I'm working on now, that focuses significantly on opportunity hoarding. Despite the Best Intentions is a book that was written about a suburban school context. It's a district that is largely middle income. It's a district that is in a liberal context where people espouse the best intentions, but those intentions haven't led to the kinds of outcomes we would hope to see in a school that is voluntarily, quote unquote, voluntarily integrated. But I'm also interested in shifting the intellectual gaze to white racial actors and the role that they play in maintaining white dominance in the context of suburban school spaces. And I use the term opportunity hoarding that was originally coined by Charles Tilly. Opportunity hoarding is the way that dominant groups monopolize educational opportunities and prevent others from having access to them. Think back to the timeline I gave you: not learning how to read, segregated schools, boarding schools, urban, suburban, rigid boundaries, et cetera, become the mechanisms through which this happens. And opportunity hoarding has long existed in the context of US schools. And opportunity hoarding is a key feature of US education today. One can think about the ways that this played out, for example, during the pandemic, in the creation of pandemic pods, where elite families were able to pool their resources in ways that advantage their kids and disadvantage others. And opportunity hoarding functions through this reality that in our society, whiteness within a racialized social system affords white people structural advantages, and it also provides them symbolic advantages, like the advantage of not being predatorily shot when you're unarmed, right, at disproportionate rates, right? Or the ability to come into a school and the school sort of bends to your will and wishes based on whiteness as a form of what we call symbolic capital, or the ability to empower oneself just by their skin color. Whiteness essentially becomes a form of property, as Cheryl Harris talks about, using her take on whiteness as property from a critical race theory lens. What people are able to do, what white racial actors are able to do in these contexts, is to use the power of their structural position and their symbolic capital to push organizations to do what they want. And I want to give a few examples of that for the next few minutes, because I do want to leave some time for us to engage with each other in conversation, because I think that can sometimes be the most fruitful part of these events. So this is what Riverview looked like when we went into the district. It was 48% white, 41.3% African-American, about 8.5% Latinx, with a smaller percentage of Asian and indigenous students. Limited, and so we'll go further. The low-income population was about, hovered around 30%. But when we looked at the classes, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about racialized tracking for the next few minutes, when we looked at the way the classes were distributed, the vast majority of students in the AP and honors classes were white, almost 90% in AP, 80% in honors classes, right? You had more of a mix, but the majority of folks in the regular classes were African-American and Latinx. And this became very clear as the superintendent was doing rounds in the school, trying to learn more about the space. And one of the things that emerged in his visits to classrooms and talking to one student in the classroom where he sat down, the student saw him come in and sit down. A Black student looked up at him and said, "You don't want to be in here. This is the dumb class," right? And it became clear to him that the racialized tracking, while he had seen it as a problem, needed urgent efforts to change. And so what the district did is really try to engage in processes that sort of detract what was happening in the context of the school. And they tried to establish mechanisms for the school to be less heavily tracked. But what wound up happening in this process is multiple forms of resistance. So white parents tried to intervene in the course placement process. As one district administrator said, "I think that school policymakers have created a monster, and a monster which supports the academic achievement gap, by allowing the parents to have the final say." What happens is a lot of times they put their kids in honors classes, they don't do well, or as well as they want, and they're getting C's, and they're paying the ones who can big bucks for tutors to teach these kids the whole time. For what? And this was very clearly talking about white parent intervention, although it doesn't say that specifically on the slide. Another example of this is as they try to create more mixed level classes in which students across achievement levels could take the courses and ultimately earn honors credits, what wound up happening was what we call internal white flight, right? As one history teacher said, the whole idea of having classes across the board reflect the mix of the school. One issue, which I don't think is much attention, is white flight, for lack of a better term. When the US history team classes were created, I think there was a movement of some white kids into American studies because that was perceived as a safe space, a safe place to be for whatever reason. And in some cases, I'm not sure they're even conscious of it. Other teachers talked about the pressure that some students got to try to move themselves into a predominantly white space that they thought had more resources. Another honors teacher said, history teacher said, many of our honors kids that I had as a freshman had parents who strong-armed them, white kids, into studying like Russian history. And they said, well, mommy, I have no interest in Russian history. I want to study Africa. They say, you're taking Russian. Or mommy, I have no interest in the Middle East. You're taking Middle East. And those classes have become largely white honors, Russian and Middle East. And then finally, as district administrators tried to make change, they got a lot of pushback from people coming into the school and threatening to leave the district or pushing them in directions that would slow the process down. As one district administrator says, I counted them at one point. I attended over 200 meetings with parents of kids to talk about the standards and the fact that we needed common standards for all kids, not different standards for different kids, and to reassure people that our high-end kids we're not dumbing down the curriculum, right? But there was a lot of resistance to this process where people wanted those honors and AP classes for their own kids in an effort to hoard opportunity. And part of that has to do with the fact that we've seen an increase in AP course taking. We've seen an increase in honors course taking. We've seen an increase in international baccalaureate courses, in part because as everyone is graduating from high school, there's an effort by racial elites and economic elites to distinguish their degrees from the degrees of other people in the context of the school. And one way to do that is to give them what looks like an exclusive education. So the more people who participate, they see it as a less valuable education for their kids. And in some cases, it's a very racialized process of racialized tracking in the context of schools that gets heavily defended. So another effort was to detrack math, right? As people talked about and understand, math is a highly sequenced subject. And in this district, in Riverview, grade 8 was a critical point. If people took algebra, they could access AP calculus and AB calculus. If they didn't take algebra, they could reach pre-calculus, but that was about it. And what wound up happening is there was a bifurcation across classes. As one district administrator said, if we'd gone 3 years ago walking around, you could have predicted just by walking in the classroom, the kids of color were all in pre-algebra. The kids in Algebra 1 were all white, and almost exclusively the Algebra 1 kids were going to get to calculus in high school, right? So they made an effort to detrack these classes even at the 8th grade level so that they could open up access to AP calculus at the high school level. And what wound up happening is they created essentially identical courses where the material was the same, the book was the same, the scope and sequence was the same. And they went to the board, and what wound up happening at the board meeting is there was still resistance. As the district administrator says, by the time we got to the board meeting, we basically could say, hey, kids are getting the same scope and sequence, the same book, the same materials. We don't need pre-algebra. We can get rid of it. And there was pushback at that board meeting. There were several community members saying, you're downgrading the quality of instruction, and predominantly from white people, exclusively from white people. The administrator said the following in frustration later in the interview. I mean, the frustrating thing is that I thought when I came into this job, we can talk to people and engage people and look them in the eye, and we can get this done in a year. It took 4 years to make that sort of change. So finally, by way of closing, I want to argue that much of what we need to do in the context of schools happens inside the context of schools, But I also want to give a shout out to the Black women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement and build on the tradition of change and activism that often pushes districts to make change in ways that we can't sort of do internally without that external pressure, right? In other words, many of the historic changes that have happened in the US education system have come from social movement activism, from nonviolent resistance, from other forms of protest that disrupt and lead to change, right? And so I think it's important to keep that alive. It's not just about what happens inside the building. So finally, by way of conclusion, I want to make a couple of arguments about the direction of research policy and practice in suburban context, something that we can all sort of move forward thinking about. I think it's really important to understand whiteness, racism, white supremacy, and opportunity hoarding in diversifying suburbs, that just a demographic change does not change what happens for Black and Latinx and Asian and Indigenous kids in the context of these schools. That we need to be consciously, constantly vigilant about trying to undermine white supremacy in the context of these schools. Secondly, I think it's really important for us to use a metropolitan and interdisciplinary framework to understand what's happening in these communities. I think we need work in social work, sociology, urban planning, and we also need to think about the interdependency between cities and suburbs to use a more metropolitan framework, both in the history and creation of suburban context, which sort of dismantled existing communities and excluded people from those communities, and to our contemporary context to think about the interdependency across these spaces, particularly as we see gentrification influencing and pushing, in some cases, people out of central cities towards suburban context. And finally, I want to just restate the importance of thinking about understanding resistance in communities, in suburban communities, and sort of how we can imagine and reimagine the recreation of suburbs that are more racially just. And I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to having some discussion and conversation.
Well, Dr. Diamond, thank you so much for that really great talk and really important content, and very relevant, especially in Pittsburgh, where we have intergenerationally had suburbs the way you've described, just because of the way segregation and job discrimination and things played out historically here, and very much tied to what you displayed on that redlining map. And I think the native Pittsburghers can look at that map and know those communities in red, and know those are our communities of color, and communities that have been economically suppressed for generations. And so if you haven't already, you can drop your questions into the Q&A, and we're going through the list. And the first question that I'll throw out comes from Cassie Quigley, who is one of our ed school faculty. And Cassie asked, the conversation around internal white flight and attempts to detrack remind me of some of the work that happened in Seattle public schools to detrack and remove standardized testing. And Cassie wants to know if the school looked at how standardized testing plays a role in tracking and de facto tracking for subjects that are not tested outside of math and ELA. So the role that standardized tests may have played in that particular school.
Yeah, I mean, sort of a broader point. I would largely advocate doing away with standardized tests for college admissions, for admissions into different educational tracks. Basically, it's a tool of opportunity hoarding. It's a tool to reproduce racial and class inequality, and it pretty much does nothing else. Unless you're using some tests obviously provide you with some formative information and feedback that you can use instructionally, but in terms of using tests to sort of place people, I think that's one of the things we could easily do away with. In fact, one of the things that Riverview has done sort of in response to the pandemic as they're bringing students into the building, I think one of the things that they're doing is while there are requirements to take tests, state requirements, there are also ways in which they're not spending as much time using final exams, potentially. as a way to sort of think about rethinking how they're going about assessing students, that grading can be more about overtime effort and engagement and demonstrated competence as opposed to a one-time test. With regard to the tracking process, one of the things that Riverview did is they opened up mixed level classes so that tests were not such a big driver of who got into those classes. What they ultimately did is sort of tried to open up classes as mixed level classes where you could earn honors credit. And by earning honors credit, that meant that you reached a high standard and you demonstrated your effort and competence so that those who weren't having the opportunity to get access to those classes, to honors credits, were able to do that by doing the extra work, as opposed to testing in, where a lot of students were testing in, coasting, getting inflated grades because teachers in honors classes didn't give C's, and getting grade weights. So all those things were happening simultaneously by virtue of getting a good score on a test. The other piece of it is the test also combines with teacher recommendations, because teachers also have, and I didn't get into this very much, but often have racial biases with regard to how they grade students, how they assess them, and how they see their future. And so the combination of test scores, teacher recommendations, and parent intervention all work to favor white students getting access to those classes, even when they didn't have sort of haven't demonstrated more ability. They've just been sort of pushed in that direction by all of those forces.
I so appreciate the way throughout your talk and in your response, Dr. Diamond, that you've been able to interweave, this theoretical perspective with this practical application. So the way these theories that our graduate students who are on this, all of our colleagues who are on this, are thinking about things, but the way they're manifesting in practice, and also what folks can do. Because I know that across the attendees there, we have school leaders, we have district leaders, we have families, we have students, we have folks from representing a lot of different communities. And so I know they're looking for some of these concrete actions that you're sharing. So we really appreciate it. The next question I want to ask comes from Olivia Payne. And Olivia asks, what actions do you suggest can be taken when the white teachers and white parents in the suburban schools are interested in making change, but the administration pushes back?
I mean, I think one of the things that's happened, for example, in Madison, where I live, at least part of the time when I'm working in Madison, one of the things that needs to happen, there are people who have control over who the administrators are, and they tend to oftentimes be the superintendents. I think it's important to get racial justice advocates on the school board. I mean, it's, to disrupt that power base. One of the things that has traditionally happened is that school boards tend to be dominated by economic elites and whites in the context of many districts, and they tend to, sort of wind up doing the bidding of parents from those communities. I think it's important to disrupt that. I also think organizing, raising voices, and for people who are sort of feel are sort of structurally advantaged to join in those movements and forms of activism, to push districts to make the kind of changes that are necessary. Because what often winds up happening is districts don't, and administrators, if they are interested and invested in maintaining the status quo, if they have the backing of powerful actors in the community, they are able to continue doing that. If that is disruptive, which it can be, I think that external pressure, I think, is really important to do that. The other thing is many districts have statements about racial justice, and if they're not holding themselves to what they say they're doing, put a mirror up to them and say, you say you're doing this and you're not doing it. So, there's a disconnect here. What's going on? The same way that Dr. King in the March on Washington, talked about the Declaration of Independence and the check not being cashed. I think you can hold people to the ideals, which tend to be stated in racially just terms, in terms of justice, and point out the contradiction and use that contradiction to push people, shame people, pressure people into making the kind of changes that you want to see. So I think it's about organizing and thinking about intervening in those kinds of ways.
Dr. Diamond, we have a question from Stephanie Riley, and she asks if you all look at demographics in support classes, and I'm assuming that would entail special education or other non-mainstream track classes throughout the school, and demographic implications of what was happening there for those spaces.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is, as you might expect, Black students are overrepresented in special education courses. They are overrepresented in some cases in what might be called support classes, which sometimes are double dose classes. Like it's an Algebra 1 class with a second period of Algebra 1 to sort of add more support for kids who may need that extra support, and it goes up to geometry and Algebra 2, et cetera. But there is definitely an overrepresentation in special ed in the district, and this is sort of a national pattern and phenomenon that district administrators have not as much. I'm thinking about Riverview in particular. District administrators have not sort of attended to as much as they might, as is the case with the increasing ELL population. English learners are not necessarily haven't necessarily gotten as much attention as they could in Riverview, and so I think that's one of the areas of work that needs to happen. And I'm talking about Riverview so much because I'm in the midst of trying to get this second book out, or this second edition out. But yeah, I think that's a really important point. The other thing about that is, with regard to the category that people are in special education, I think the disproportionality depends on the category. And we need to, sort of tease that apart as well. That there are ways in which categories like autism, dyslexia, and other, categories are in some ways different than some of the more quote unquote subjective categories where the disproportionality tends to be bigger, right? So.
I appreciate that. This is excellent. And I'm looking at the clock too and thinking how Jay mentioned this hour would fly, and it really has. So our next question comes from Monique, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this last name right. Khumalo, Khumalo. And Monique says, this has been an excellent presentation. This also relates to issues around racialized discipline and how youth are, quote, pushed out as another mechanism to maintain segregated settings. And then Monique asks, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in the book, and I've been writing a lot about recently, is this disproportionality in discipline. I think there are a number of things that need to be done with regard to that. My argument is that discipline practices are not just about suspension and expulsion, but they're about this relationship of racial domination and subordination that schools tend to perpetuate. As Black people, for example, I can speak from my own experience. There's a calculus in just going on vacation. There's a calculus on just moving around the world. There's a calculus around being safe in police interactions, but there's a calculus around going shopping. And that the schools tend to, in the same way that Black people live surveilled lives, tend to do that in the context of schools as well. So there's a hyper focus on Black kids and discipline. To a lesser extent to Latinx kids and discipline, and depending on context, it can also be sort of played out in different ways across racial group. But schools oftentimes tend to have a hyper focus on Black kids' behavior, and they also tend to adultify that behavior, as Ann Ferguson talks about. They make Black young people out to be somehow criminals or violent. And if you think about it, it has historic reverberations in what you might call the afterlife of slavery. And I'm sorry, my mind is skipping away on the person who coined that phrase, but there's a lot of work on anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness that talks about this sort of historic relationship of surveillance and control that has been handed down across generations. In a lot of ways, schools tend to be doing the same thing in the contemporary context. Deontay Owens at Brown has done some really powerful research on the ways in which people think Black kids are suspended because they misbehave. The reality is almost 50% of the disproportionality is tied to school practices and not student behavior, right? Her paper on this is really, I think she has a couple co-authors as well, is really powerful in sort of laying this out in a quantitative analysis of discipline action. So we did spend a lot of time on that issue. There's a lot to unpack, but I think a core focus of the work is really trying to think about how do you disrupt the organizational routines that lead to disproportionality. That is, teachers sending kids out of classrooms, teachers hyper surveilling Black kids, and then once they get in the discipline process, the ways in which they are treated differently than their white counterparts in the context of schools, even within the same school and across schools, where discipline tends to be harsher in schools that are predominantly African American.
We're going to take one last question, and this question asks, can you say more about a metropolitan and interdisciplinary framework? Are there specific scholars who engage in this work?
Yeah, I think Myron Orfield in Minnesota has done a lot of work. I think he's in the law school or political science. So Myron Orfield's work kind of speaks to this. I think my colleague Lynn Posey-Maddox is working on this. One of my outstanding graduate students, Maria Velasquez, is working on this in the Bay Area, thinking about the relationship between gentrification and sort of displacement to suburbs for communities of color. So there are a number of people who are engaged in this kind of work. My recall isn't always what it used to be, but there are other folks out there doing this work who sort of think about these relationships across context. And I think it's important to think about it from a historical standpoint. I think there's good work as well that really tries to sort of unpack these processes by folks like John Rury, who's a historian who's sort of looked at this. He's got a nice book with Darby from University of Michigan, but also some of his other work in history journals that sort of tries to unpack this relationship. So.
Well, Dr. Diamond, we're out of time, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And really, you know, I wrote on Facebook that you were dropping knowledge, to use a old school term, and really enlightening us on these dynamics in the suburban spaces and the critical nature of really studying and acting in these spaces. I know we have people in the audience that are working for racial justice in suburban districts and trying to form these committees and advocate and make change. So thank you for all you do. Thank you to all the scholars that showed up. Thank you to Dr. Delali O'Connor for being a part of this, the School of Education and the Center for Urban Education for supporting this event and co-leading this event with us. On behalf of the Center on Race and Social Problems and the School of Social Work, we thank you for joining us. We'll be back June 2nd with Dr. Eddie Glaude from Princeton University for such a time as this with our partners at the African American Strategic Partnership. So registration coming soon on that. Mark your calendars, June 2nd. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you next time. Take care.